couple minutes past, so I'm going to get started. Hope everyone's having a good GraphQL conf so far. My name is Ben Sklar. I'm a senior product manager at Salesforce, and I'm excited today to talk to you all about what it's like to launch a public GraphQL API at scale, as well as a client. In our case, it's for our open source framework called the Lightning Web Components Framework. And again, a little bit more about me. I'm Ben Sklar. I'm a senior PM at Salesforce. I love GraphQL. I also love to ski. I also like to hike. But before I get started, we have this slide in any Salesforce talk that you ever go to. Just keep in mind that some of the things I might be saying could be future-looking or forward-facing. So please base any purchasing decisions on what we have commercially available today. So I'm going to talk about our GraphQL API, and then I'm going to talk about our Lightning Web Components client. I'm going to talk about mobile offline as well, which was some of the inspirations for us building GraphQL at Salesforce. And at the end, I'll do some Q&A. So let's start with why GraphQL. So we had some problems that we wanted to solve. One of them was to find something that was an industry standard. So one of the problems that we had at Salesforce is, let's say you want to build UI and you're not sure the IDs for the specific records that you want to display on a page. Well, we have our own query language called Salesforce Object Query Language, or SOQL, and you can use that to find the IDs and get some information about those records. But when building UI, we're going to see this later on our client, it's not so straightforward, and it adds additional work on the developer. So there are some certain things that we can do better with GraphQL. GraphQL is also a single endpoint that works across multiple resources. And so today, we actually have a lot of traditional REST APIs. We have a Trailhead. I'm not sure if any of you, who here has used Trailhead before? Okay, some of you. If you haven't used it, it's basically our learning platform. And we have a Trailhead that kind of goes over all of our APIs. And still, developers are not sure which API they should use. Some of our APIs do the same things as other APIs, so there's some I'm forgetting the word, but they do the same thing. So that's not necessarily great. And so we have, with this GraphQL API, when we were thinking about building, having one endpoint that gives you everything you need is something that was attractive to us. This one endpoint allows us to get all the data you need in one call so that you can avoid under and overfetching data. This is something that a lot of the other speakers have mentioned. And it is also schema-driven, declarative. It allows data introspection and easy-to-use developer tooling. So GraphQL is a really powerful tool. I'm not sure who here has used GraphQL. Okay, decent number of us. It makes it very easy to build GraphQL queries, and I'm going to demo that shortly here. So why make a GraphQL public API at Salesforce? One of the reasons is, although we have all these different traditional REST APIs, we can't make a REST API for every single use case. And when I first joined Salesforce, I was given a laundry list of requests from a certain customer that they wanted all these different specific bespoke REST APIs to be created for them. And that just isn't scalable. So where GraphQL really helped us is it allows you to actually shape the response that you're going to get back, and again, request exactly what you need, so we don't have to keep building specific bespoke APIs for our customers. We also found GraphQL to be very performant and scalable. It also is now powering our mobile offline and low connectivity situations. We have Salesforce Mobile App Plus and the Salesforce Field Service app, and in both of those apps, we're using GraphQL to power these offline experiences, and if we have time, I'll show you a quick demo on that too. And as I said before, the ability to query for object data and metadata without knowing the IDs is really helpful, especially with our Lightning Web Components framework. So we're going to see that later too. So we have a unique challenge at Salesforce in that every single user sees something different. So we have objects like accounts, opportunities, etc. And based on your specific permissions, you might see certain fields that other people don't see. A good example is social security number on, let's say, a user object. Perhaps someone in HR has power to see that, and maybe you do too, but a lot of other people won't have the power to see that. So when we were building our GraphQL API, in the initial stages, we had some failures in terms of trying to figure out how do we build this API. And when it comes to GraphQL, typical GraphQL APIs have a static schema. But we knew we needed something dynamic, and we also knew that just filtering out fields for users wasn't enough. We actually, in the crowd over there, have our developer, Spencer McKinnon, former colleague, who helped to develop the dynamic meta schema. He's going to talk more about it tomorrow at 1:30 in this room. So if you want to hear more about that, come to his talk. But in a nutshell, every single user has a different schema that is dynamic. It's not simply static. And as admins update the schema may change. So it's something unique for us. And if you're building enterprise GraphQL APIs, this might be interesting to you. So definitely come see Spencer's talk to learn more about how this works. So some of the features of the GraphQL API that we provide at Salesforce include field selection and resource aggregations. So you specifically choose what fields you want returned back to you, or what resources, whether that is your accounts object, opportunities, whether you have info about specific objects, object infos, which is metadata, or the data for those objects. You can do it all in a single call. You can also introspect your schema. And at Salesforce, trust is our #1 priority. And so we have what's called field level security and object level security. And our GraphQL API supports both of these, so users will never see fields or objects that they don't have access to. Now, when it comes on the client side, we're going to see this. When you write your queries, today, you need to make sure that any user has access to those fields who's going to be using those components that you build. There is a future feature we want to build called optional fields so that some users can see more things than others. But for now, when you're writing your queries on the client, make sure that every user that's going to use that component has access to the fields and objects. And again, I've already mentioned this before, record queryability without the ID. We've talked a lot about queries, but we're also launching mutations in our next release in a beta. It's Winter 24 release, which is being released next month to production for everybody. And so with that, not only will you be able to pull data out of Salesforce, but you can also write data to Salesforce. So a few more cool things before I get into my demo. With GraphQL, we were able to take what previously took a few different REST calls into a single request with GraphQL. In certain cases, we found this to be much more performant and scalable, especially in mobile and low connectivity situations. And we actually went GA about a year ago with this API. And so single endpoint, get the data you need, performant and scalable. The client, we are just GAing, as I mentioned, in this winter release. So I'm going to demo both for you today. So let's start with the Salesforce GraphQL API and see some of the cool things we can do. So I'm going to be pulling up Graphical here. And there's a few things that I will do off the bat. I'm going to start with introspection. So we can see that we can do both queries and mutations. And again, mutations are brand new. So if I go to it, it is a beta. And we can see you can create accounts, update them, delete them, etc. Queries, I'm going to go into this. And we have a few different things here. I'm going to highlight our record queryability. And you can see account at the top here. So we can see some of the information for it. I'm going to go in here, see some of the fields that I have access to. And again, if I didn't have access to these fields, they would not show up here. So let's run a query, just a simple query for accounts. And I'm going to take a look. So here are the accounts in my org. And if I go to my actual org, I can go ahead and see that we've got 9 accounts. Here are these accounts right here. and I was able to get those with GraphQL. And again, this is significant. I didn't know those record IDs. Here's the ID right here. With our traditional endpoints, with our user interface API, I actually would need those IDs to get the information back for those records. We also have some aggregate functionality. In this case, I can find out I have 9 accounts at my company, and right here, 9 accounts. You can also do, as I said, data and metadata in a single call. So right here, I can do a query for accounts and cases, and then maybe some object infos on the account. And again, I am building these queries for my own use cases. So previously, customers would be like, okay, I need this and this and this, and I want it returned in this specific endpoint. Well, now you get to shape what you get back from the server. Something that's also pretty notable is the addition of tasks and events as objects to our GraphQL API. I'm not sure how many of you have actually developed on Salesforce, but we have a big gap with our user interface API where the task and events objects are actually not included, and those are standard objects. And for a lot of reasons, they're not included. Legacy stuff, I won't get into it, but we're able to bring this as a beta to the GraphQL API, again, in this Winter 24 release. It's a very exciting release for us. So I'm going to query for the tasks in this org, and I've got a few tasks here. One is to go to the tower, one is for Dreamforce. And I'm going to go ahead now and create a new task. So I'm going to say task for GraphQL conf. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and run this mutation here. Wait for that to create. All right, so it created that new task. I'm going to go ahead into my tasks. And I can see right here, task for GraphQL conf was created at 3:54 p.m. today. Maybe one last example before I get into the client side. Another really great example of why the GraphQL API is so powerful. Let's say you're in sales and you want to find out all the opportunities at your org where the amount is greater than $100,000. Well, we can go ahead and do that with GraphQL. Didn't need to know, again, the IDs for those opportunities. I can actually get them back if I wanted, which they're right here, but here they are. These are the opportunities. So it's super powerful, and if you already have Salesforce, you should definitely check it out. I'll share some links where you can get started. All right. Let's talk about our Lightning Web Components, which is our open source framework for building UI, specifically for Salesforce. If you are a JavaScript developer, this will be pretty easy and familiar to you. So our Lightning Web Components, a few things really quick. So for one, we have enhanced productivity with web standards. Again, it's built off of JavaScript, it's engineered for performance, and it's compatible and easy to use. So we have this screenshot here. If you see these boxes over here, these are examples of Lightning Web Components. They're sort of, the intent is to have them be reusable. And so you can either create these with clicks or code. You can customize them. And now we have this new GraphQL wire adapter for the Lightning Web Components. And it interfaces directly with our GraphQL API. And there's a lot of benefits with this wire adapter. Some of these benefits include caching. So some of the talks earlier today talked about how caching is a very hard problem. We take care of a lot of that for you. So if things don't change on the server, we have improved app performance for you. You don't have to worry about checking to see if data has changed. We now have native queryability right from the Lightning Web Components. We have data consistency guarantees. And again, that comes from that Lightning Data Service and caching layer. And right now, this is supported offline in the Salesforce App Plus and Field Service mobile apps. If you build it today, we don't have mobile offline support quite yet for your custom applications of this, but it is something that we are interested in bringing. And one more feature as well, when you're using our wire adapters, it takes away some of the pain of authorization and authentication when you're directly calling an API. So lots of benefits to using our wire adapter. So as I said before, kind of one of the problems that we had was, let's say you have a Lightning Web component and you want to get data for that component. Before we had the GraphQL wire adapter, you would have had to build an Apex controller, write a SOQL query, and again, this is if you didn't know the IDs for the records that you wanted to retrieve. If you knew the IDs, you could use our user interface API, which we have wire adapters for as well. But if you didn't, you'd have to actually do the SOQL query, the Apex controller. If you don't know what Apex is, it's a programming language that Salesforce created, similar to Java, and SOQL is our query language. And so there is some drawbacks, as I mentioned. If you don't have the record IDs, that was the only really way to do it. But now we have the GraphQL wire adapter. So let's take a look at that. So this is what we call LWC recipes, which you can, it's open source. You can take a look at it. It's on GitHub. I'll share some links, and you can get started today with GraphQL and other things as well. So these are examples of Lightning Web components, and all of these components were built using GraphQL queries. One more thing to note as well, in our GA release of the wire adapter, it only supports queries. Mutations are not yet supported. Typically at Salesforce, we build features on the server first, so for the API, and then we bring those features to the client. So let's take a look at this GraphQL contacts, which is showing a list of contacts. And I'm gonna open up the code just so you can take a look. And you can see we have the @wire, that's our wire adapter for GraphQL. And basically what we did is we just put in a query right here, and it's the same query that you would write against the API to get you these contacts right here. And it's pretty much as simple as this. We've got, HTML and some other stuff, but this is much easier than having to go and write your own Apex controller and SOQL query and then bringing that into Lightning Web Components. Now you can directly access this with our wire adapter. And so I highly encourage all of you to take a look at the LWC recipes as well. Okay, so what about low connectivity in mobile? Because that was one of the original inspirations for the GraphQL API and wire adapter at Salesforce. So as I said, we have in the Salesforce Field Service app and the Mobile App Plus, we have offline data access with GraphQL. And a good example of this is, let's say that you are in field service and you go underground and you lose connection on your phone. You still want to be able to use Salesforce. And so GraphQL powers that experience. And if you do make changes while you're offline, once you're back online, all of that will get sent to the server and you can continue to use the app even when you're offline. I'm going to show a quick demo, and this one was pre-recorded. So in this case, someone is in a hospital and they're scanning a barcode. So let's get through that. Essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to say for the thing that they're scanning that it's not working, and they want to input that. And I don't know if any of you have worked in a hospital, but sometimes either the Wi-Fi doesn't work very well or your cell phone connection doesn't work very well. One or the other, there's usually a problem. So they're saying this defibrillator has a problem. And right now they're online, so everything's working just fine. So they recorded it. Again, they are online. We're now going to go into airplane mode. And I believe it'll still say that they're connected to the Wi-Fi at the hospital, but the Wi-Fi at the hospital doesn't actually work, so we'll see that in a second. They're showcasing a little bit of the code right here. And as I mentioned, our Lightning Web Components framework is open source. So definitely take a look at some of the code that we have on GitHub if you want to see some of these queries and how they work with our framework. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. So they're going to go ahead and go offline, and we're going to see a pop-up where it says no internet connection. Again, they are on the hospital Wi-Fi, but it doesn't actually work. So they're going to go ahead and scan it again, and they're going to go ahead and say the same thing. There's a problem with the defibrillator. They submitted it. It was recorded. It all works, even offline, and we're using GraphQL to power this, which is super exciting. And again, I would love to bring this to our customers' custom apps. So we'd love to hear from you on our Salesforce ID Exchange if this is something that you'd be interested in. So just to give you some information about our timeline, we GA'd our API in winter of 23. That was a year ago. And then after that, we did a pilot for the GraphQL wire adapter. And then after that, we did a beta. So each release, we try to do a pilot, then the next release a beta, and then finally we GA. And we did the same process with the API. And so finally in winter 24, very exciting release. We have mutation support in the API. Our client adapter is going GA, and we have a couple of really important objects, tasks, and events that will be available from the API. So if you've ever built something with the user interface API and you thought to yourself, why can't I access tasks and events? Try out our GraphQL API. You'll be able to do it now. So feel free to take a picture of this or scan the QR code if you want to get started with our API. We have documentation on the wire, the API. We have the Lightning Web Components recipes, which is, again, open source. We have a whole Trailblazer community that you can join. And we have an LWC trailhead, where if you've never used LWC, you don't know what that is, maybe you've never used Salesforce and you just want to get your own instance and try it out, you can do that on Trailhead, try it out, and then use our GraphQL API, all for free, again, using Trailhead, our learning platform. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions, but thank you guys.
Sir, over here on the table.
That's right. If you have a question, please grab a mic, or maybe someone can run it over to you. That way everybody can hear.
So you mentioned each user gets a different object definition. So does it mean that you dynamically generate the schema on the fly?
Essentially, yes. So for every single user, we dynamically generate the schema for that user based on their permissions. As I mentioned before, my colleague Spencer is going to talk about that more in detail and kind of talk through some of the technical challenges and performance and caching and some of that. So if you're interested in that, tomorrow at 1:30 in this room is a good place to be if you want to hear more about how that works.
All right. Hey, I think we use Salesforce Health Cloud from our side. I was wondering if the GraphQL APIs have made their way into that product, or if those are two separate areas of the company.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Health Cloud is one of our core Salesforce clouds, including sales, service, et cetera. As we build features and APIs on the Salesforce platform, they can be used across different Salesforce clouds like sales, service. Health Cloud is one example. So in this case, yes, you'd be able to use the Salesforce GraphQL API with Health Cloud. So for all your Health Cloud objects, data, metadata needs, definitely try it out. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the dynamic schema. Maybe that'll have people think about questions. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons why we needed this dynamic meta schema over just using a static schema is at Salesforce, we have many orgs, and every single org basically has their own schema, and that schema is ever changing as people create new objects, new fields. If they remove them, if they're not being used, can't remove something that's already being used, but across all these different orgs, we couldn't simply filter out. And again, from a security standpoint, we wanted to make it such that field level and object level security truly work, and filtering was not enough. And I know that other enterprises have similar needs, and I'm always curious what other enterprises have done to kind of solve this problem of users having different access to different fields and objects. So it's definitely a challenge that exists across different companies. So, yeah.
Hi, Ben. You probably guessed what my question is going to be about. Especially with this dynamic schema business, like how do you do caching?
Yeah, someone was asking that earlier as well. And like I said before, it might be better suited for Spencer to talk about tomorrow at 1:30.
Okay, all right.
That said, I'll talk a little bit about our Lightning data service. And I won't get into too much of the technical details, but as a developer, caching is very hard. And knowing when things on the server change is also sometimes difficult. And having to ping the server and figure out, okay, did something change? Again, it's not easy, and you might end up spending a lot of API calls doing that. So that's why we built the Lightning data service and our wire adapters, not just with GraphQL, but it also works with traditional REST. We want to make sure that in our framework, at least, in our Lightning web component framework, that we handle that on behalf of the developers, because it's a hard problem to solve. So I hope that answers that, but definitely for more information and some of the technical details, tomorrow 1:30 in this room.
Thanks.
Hey, could you go into a little more detail about the offline support and how GraphQL integrates with that?
Yeah. So GraphQL is being used, and one of the way it's being used, we call it data priming, at least on the getting the data to the device. So for field service agents, we're constantly priming the cache on the device so that when they do go offline, all that data is on the cache. And we found GraphQL to be much more performant and scalable than other options. So with our data priming with very, very large customers, we sometimes have thousands of concurrent users, with each user potentially priming hundreds of thousands of records on their devices, and GraphQL has made that possible in minutes. In terms of the actual implementation, I won't go in there, but it solved that problem in terms of being able to access the data on your phone in an offline way, and it did it in a much more performant and scalable way than the other solutions we tried. So.
Just to add a little bit to that answer, for offline resolution of those records, there's basically specs for both filtering and ordering certain types of records. And then the client, when it's in an offline mode, it actually parses the relevant arguments and then translates that to a query against its own data store as well. So why GraphQL was another key aspect for us was that it was also a way to convey through the schema what the server should execute, of course, but also what the client can do with that information as well.
Maybe one more thing to add as well with offline and some of the benefits GraphQL provides is when it comes to mutations, you can ship a bunch of things in a single call that traditional REST, you might have to make multiple calls. So once you're back online, all those changes that you made locally, you can ship them all in one call. We also do something called idempotent writes. So a challenge we've had in the past is sometimes when you lose connectivity, maybe they went online and they started shipping back to the server and then they lost internet again. If you don't use idempotent rights, you might end up creating data on the server and actually duplicating that because it goes back again. So we now use what's called an idempotency key, and that's available today for our UI API, at least for customers, and eventually it'll be available in GraphQL for customers too. But essentially it prevents the duplication of data. And why this is really important is, let's say you are going to fix a broken air conditioner and you need to order a new capacitor. And if that gets ordered multiple times, maybe that part's not super expensive. Maybe you're ordering a new compressor, which is a lot more expensive, and you don't want that duplicated. So another thing to keep in mind. The idempotency key? The question was, where is the key tracked? So in terms of, I'll talk about it in terms from the customer perspective. So as you're making the call, you create your own idempotency key, and then that key is used for a certain duration of time. And then eventually you can reuse that key later if you want, but it's essentially for short periods of time where you might lose connectivity. That one key is used for the first write, and then once that write occurs, you're still sending us that same idempotency key. We won't make that same write with that same idempotency key. So we'll store that on our side, and again, we'll store it for a period of time. I think it's about a day or so, and then for that day, that idempotency key is tied to that record, and then after the day, we wipe out the idempotency key on our end. So you could reuse it later if you wanted. It's a good question. So it depends if you want something to be all or none, but typically in this case, you would probably want an idempotency key for each record that's being written, such that you will retry if something fails to make sure that thing got written, as opposed to the batch. If you just had it for the batch, you might end up in the case where one thing failed, so then you all of a sudden rewrite other things. So in this case, it's better to use it for each record you want written. Any other questions? All right, if anyone thinks of anything, I'll be around. Feel free to come up to me or connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you all for attending, and hope you enjoy the rest of your GraphQL Conf. Thank you.